Read the book, The Princess Bride. I had liked that movie for kind of literally almost as long as I can remember. I saw it for the first time when I was a kid, I suppose, and had loved it for years, but finally a few years ago read the book that the movie was based on. In that version of the book, it had at the end the first chapter of the supposed sequel. And there's debate, I guess, over how serious the author was. William Goldman was known to kind of play with people. I think he was a bit of a prankster. I don't know that he ever actually intended on writing a second book, but they included in the edition that I was reading the first chapter of the planned sequel that he just sort of never got around to writing. And reading that additional chapter, I guess, clarified something for me that I guess I know about myself, but didn't know in those clear terms maybe. I really don't like sequels. Maybe you're the same way, and there are the rare exceptions to that rule, I guess. But generally speaking, you have a story that you like. You followed these characters. They've had the great conflict in their lives that they've overcome. They've saved the day, they've saved the world, they've saved the galaxy, whatever it is. You get the happy ending at the end, and things are good. And then you come back for part two, and you find they're having trouble again, or this guy died, or these people who got together at the end of that aren't together anymore, and they hate each other now, and everything has gone bad. Now we have to do it all over again. Because most stories have a character arc, the characters sort of change as they progress through them. Well, this guy was a jerk at the beginning of the story, and then he was a good guy at the end, but now the sequel starts, and we've got to do something with him again. So he's a jerk at the beginning, and you think, well, I like that guy. Don't make him a jerk. A lot of times that sequel just kind of ruins and inevitably undoes the happy ending that you might have been left with. And that can be very disappointing to us. However, when we consider reality, we understand that life is that way, isn't it? If you think of whatever the great conflict of your life might have been, or the most exciting part of it that someone would have actually taken the time to write a story about, and you resolved all of that, and things seemed like they were going well at the end of that conflict, what happened to you after that point? You had ups and downs, didn't you? Things didn't just keep on ascending from that point, and you lived happily ever after, so to speak. You still had difficult days. You had a new challenge over the horizon. Really, every day or every year that we live has a sequel following after it. And things are going to go bad at times in that sequel. And we're going to undo some of the progress that we might have made. Real life is that way. There are highs and lows, successes and failures, peaks and valleys. Simply our experience in this world. When we're looking at this section in Matthew's Gospel, we're going to be looking at chapter 17 this morning, and you can be turning there. This section finds several possible high points of glory that will be seemingly toppled by frustrating setbacks immediately afterward. And this is the nature of the gospel, largely because I think the gospels are recounting to us true stories. They're recording real life. They're recording real history. And in real life, happily ever after isn't a thing. And reaching that point of success and only improving and only building upon it, only growing wiser, only growing better, is not usually our experience. We rise and then we fall, and then we try to rise again. Through all of this section, we will find Jesus, and our focus, especially at the end of today's lesson, will be on the Savior. But pay attention as we go through to how he patiently works to prepare his disciples as he moves steadily towards his ultimate goal, his ultimate purpose, which is the cross. But he'll guide them through these peaks and valleys, as we'll see even here in chapter 17. I hope you have found Matthew 17 in your Bibles. Please let me pause for a moment to say thank you for being here. We are very glad to have this opportunity to come together. Some of you are with us for the first time. We're very thankful for that. Some of you, well, I'm used to seeing you all the time, so who cares, right? No, we're happy to see you no matter how often we get to and what the circumstances are for your being here. I simply hope, as we look at this great chapter together, that it will increase your appreciation for Christ and will lead you to a closer walk with him, a greater walk of faith. That will be my aim this morning. So let's see what Matthew is telling us about in chapter 17. We begin with the account of the Transfiguration. Taylor read for us a moment ago in verses 1 through 13. Matthew tells us this is 6 days after. I think he's referring to the events in Caesarea Philippi in chapter 16, probably including that whole trip, so to speak. It was there in Caesarea Philippi, 6 days previous, that Peter had confessed Jesus as Christ. And it was also there 6 days ago in Caesarea Philippi that Peter had rebuked Jesus for saying that the Christ would be killed and resurrected. Ups and downs in the life of Peter already. The Transfiguration itself is a strange, unique sign. And it is, I think, difficult to even say exactly what that term means or what we should be picturing. A transfiguration. I don't know of any context outside of the Gospels where we even use that word, where that terminology is ever even employed. What does it mean? It means he was changed. Something about his appearance changed and was altered. Most of the miracles that Matthew has shown us have some biblical precedent. And I think that's largely on purpose. I think you could, in fact, look at Moses and Elijah, who will appear alongside Jesus here in this passage, and find them as the precedent of a sort. The shadow for the substance that Jesus will give. Moses parts the Red Sea so that Israel can cross through it. Jesus walks on the water of the Sea of Galilee. Elijah feeds the widow and her family and himself from the oil and the flour, the bread that keeps regenerating day after day. Jesus gathers a crowd of thousands and feeds them with a boy's small lunch. People are healed, and Moses was able to heal leprosy. We see many similar things happening, many kind of new and improved versions of signs that had been offered before. Jesus performs those. But you might have a hard time finding a direct comparison to this event. Maybe it would be similar to Moses going to his own Mount Sinai and confronted with the glory and the holiness of God, having his face shine as he came down. Maybe being changed in some way, we might say, from that encounter. But really, this feels like a totally unique thing, something that Jesus did that did not have a forerunner, that did not have a precedent. The era of special effects has probably desensitized our imaginations a little bit. I wonder about that sometimes. I mentioned the Red Sea a minute ago, and you can do that with a computer that you could buy for $100. You could make something on the screen that looked like the Red Sea parting, and you could picture exactly what that might look like if you had the skill in rendering things like that. And you could put that on a movie, and you could let everyone watch it and say, wow, we get to see the Red Sea parting. It was not the case for people thousands of years ago, of course. To see those things, they had to actually see them. Maybe imagine them in their mind's eye, but it's very easy for us in this day and age, it seems, to picture the impossible, so to speak. But try to picture what the disciples actually saw, what they lived, what happened right in front of them, as Jesus begins with his own true light, begins to shine. He's changed before their very eyes to a display, a glimmer of sorts of his own divine glory. To see this man that you know, that you spent a lot of time with, and who, for all you can tell in being able to poke his arm or watching him eat or seeing his feet crack and blister when you're walking all day and seeing his skin burn and redden when you're out in the sun too long. This is a normal man just like any that you've ever met, and yet now here he is glowing shining, being changed into this glorious image. And then, not only that, men appear beside him, Moses and Elijah, speaking with him. I don't know how they were identified as Moses and Elijah. People ask that question sometimes. How would you know? They didn't have pictures of those men. We don't know what Moses would have looked like. If Abraham Lincoln and George Washington appeared here beside me, you'd know them because we know what they looked like. I don't know how you identify Moses and Elijah. Maybe their dress, maybe some identifying objects that they were holding. I think probably through their conversation with Jesus, it was clear who these men actually were. But regardless, they're two figures of great importance, with some notable similarities that may be important to this story. Both of them died under unusual circumstances, didn't they? Moses died and was buried essentially by God himself, the text tells us. Elijah was not buried at all. He ascends in this flaming whirlwind of heavenly chariots. Both of them had an idea attached to them, maybe for that reason, of a return or of a second coming. You look at passages like Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, or the prophecy in Malachi, where both are mentioned, that idea of that Spirit returning, of there being an Elijah that will come back, there being a Moses that would return to the people. And so these two men are usually identified as pillars of sorts that symbolize the law and the prophets of the Old Testament era. Maybe that's intended. More likely, I think these are simply the two greatest representatives that Peter or James or John would be able to conceive of when you're thinking of people who spoke for God. If you picture the ideal of a prophet, a mouthpiece for Jehovah, for the Jewish mind of the first century, in Peter's imagination, James, John, whoever else it might be, tell me who the greatest among the prophets are. I think you might very well get those two answers, Moses and Elijah. They're the ones we look to. Those are the spirits that we must follow. So Peter sees them and responds maybe predictably. Characteristically impulsive offer from Peter, but we can understand. It's Moses and Elijah. They're great. They're the heroes of our people, and we're getting to see them. We should make them comfortable. I'll make some tents. I'll make some tabernacles to house you all, to show honor. But Jesus reveals that offer of Peter for the nonsense that it was. Moses and Elijah were great, but they were undeserving of equal honor with the Son of God. These were not three equals standing before the disciples. They also then see a cloud. That's always symbolic of God's glory. And here now it is, with Jesus, with the Son. They hear the mighty heavenly voice identify the Son and order them to listen to Jesus. They fall on their faces, but are gently taken back to their feet by Jesus, and the whole ordeal ends peacefully enough. They question Jesus about this at the end of the passage, and he corrects that misapplication of Malachi's prophecy that we referred to a moment ago in chapter 4. Elijah was not going to be reborn in a physical sense, that you would find someone that had the literal soul of Malachi put back into him, of Elijah. That this would be a rebirth, a reincarnation of some kind. The same way some philosophies have the idea of being reincarnated as different creatures, as different people. If you're bad right now, you come back as a cricket. This is not, Elijah is going to be reincarnated among us. No, Jesus is telling them what's actually going to happen. That same spirit that was within Elijah, his intensity, his zeal for God, what he revealed, how he stood before the people, and the Spirit of God that testified through him. That was going to, and in fact had already returned among the people in the form of John the Baptist. You might translate verse 11 to be a semi-rhetorical question. Now, isn't Elijah coming first to restore all things? And then Jesus answers it in verse 12. Well, he already did. He already did, and what happened when he came back? Men simply rejected him and killed him the same way they're going to treat me very soon. Jesus will have more to say about this in just a moment. But pay attention as we move on into verse 14. Right after this peak, a wonderful manifestation of God's glory. And can you imagine what Peter and James and John are thinking in this moment, and how blessed they feel themselves, how privileged they might feel themselves to be, that they witness this amazing thing that almost defies description. They see his glory, his preeminence, his authority. Now Jesus goes back down to the foot of the mountain to find chaos. Mark's account in Mark chapter 9, verse 15, might capture the scene even better. He says, when Jesus came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them, and scribes disputing with them. And immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, and running to him, greeted Jesus. But you've got the disciples trying to do one thing, and you've got other people over here who are kind of arguing with them and surrounding them, trying to figure out what's going on. And you've got scribes telling them, you're doing it all wrong. What are you guys actually doing? You just have this chaotic scene. And then we have this man yell out from the crowd. And we learn what the root cause of all the chaos has been, evidently. The disciples have been frustrated in their attempts to heal a boy, this man's son, who was demon-possessed. And the Lord's response in verse 17 reveals his frustration with seemingly everyone, a faithless and perverse generation. And you can understand the Lord's viewpoint of this when you consider what he's been doing for the last several months, maybe a couple of years by this point. Everywhere he goes, he finds corruption. He finds disbelief. And most tragically, that disbelief seems to include, for the moment, those 9 remaining apostles who had been left behind. They had been given authority to cast out demons. They had done this, in fact, on other occasions. But now they had been trying and failing to carry out their work in the absence of Jesus. Nothing is mentioned about the man or this boy needing belief to receive healing. This is not a case as of we see with faith healers, so-called faith healers today, where if I was unable to perform the miracles I usually perform, that you'll have to take my word for, that I actually do, I couldn't do it this time because your faith was not strong enough. I'm sorry. It's your fault. I can't help you. There's no indication of that in this passage, that their belief was needed to receive healing. But it was certainly necessary on the part of the disciples. And apparently, in this occasion, they had come up empty. You're faithless. He says in verse 20, it's because of your unbelief that it didn't work. Jesus takes the time. Again, you picture almost some frustrated dismissiveness to what happens here. He demonstrates his characteristic superiority over all things. He casts out the demon with just a word. Go, be gone. That's dealt with immediately. That's not really the key problem within this entire ordeal. Instead, it's the fact that the disciples have not been where they need to be in their belief. A low point. We'll come back to that idea in just a minute. In verse 22, Jesus foretells his death and his resurrection. This is now for the second time. They begin their sojourn through Galilee. Jesus doubles down on his earlier predictions concerning his death. This time, compared to the first one, he seems to indicate that it will happen very soon. He's about to be betrayed into the hands of men. It's coming. He also adds the detail that he will be betrayed. No rebuke is mentioned from Peter this time, but the disciples still don't seem to recognize that Jesus is describing the very point of his mission on earth, the whole reason he came to begin with, because they're exceedingly sorrowful. Again, we understand from their perspective. We can't fault them for that reaction. But it does betray an ongoing lack of understanding. of what the whole purpose of the Messiah coming to the world was. Now finally, for the text itself, we move on into verse number 24. And this account is one that Matthew alone records. Matthew himself, a former tax collector of a different kind, but one who is used to gathering in taxes, will tell us this story of Jesus and Peter discussing the temple tax. Every man of Israel over 20 years of age would be required to pay out a sum, a relatively small sum, seems it was about 2 days' wages, that he would be required annually to help with the upkeep of the temple. We call this the temple tax sometimes. Now, Peter is asked about this in verse 24. Does your teacher not pay the temple tax? No mention is given of the motive behind this question. It comes from those who gather it, so we might be able to assume. But it could have been a polite query as to whether Peter's teacher was going to offer payment. Rabbis were exempt from this, it seems, and maybe they are trying to ask, is he legitimate or not? Has he received an exemption from this, or should we expect his payment? It could just as well be another setup, a trick question to try to trap Jesus and get people to turn against him. That happens very often in the Gospels. We just can't say one way or another. Peter, for his part, answers at the beginning of verse 25, apparently without thinking, he's going to pay, of course. But then as the story continues, it seems maybe he wasn't actually sure about that he had not talked to Jesus about this, that it hadn't come up about whether or not they should pay the temple tax. And you can picture Peter walking back home or walking back to where Jesus was with a bit of an internal debate. And so that explains Jesus anticipating him when he comes in and saying, what do you think about that, Peter? You've been working through this in your mind. What kind of conclusions are you reaching? On the other hand, it's just as clear that Peter hadn't actually thought through the logic of the situation, which Jesus will point out in his questions to Peter. Does it make sense for Jesus to pay the temple tax? Jesus is the Son of God. The temple is the house of God. Sons don't pay taxes for the upkeep of their own royal homes. Jesus then should be free from this duty. But showing exactly who he was and his character in verse 27, to avoid offense, Jesus is really concerned with his own rights and privileges. That's, I'm sure, an understatement. But here, to avoid scandalizing well-meaning Israelites, he says, we'll pay the tax anyway. But they do it from an unexpected source. They cast in a line, throw the hook in the water. This is the first, only time, I guess, anyone fishes with a hook in the New Testament. Usually you see a net being used. But with that even smaller, more specific method of fishing, Jesus says, you will catch the fish that will help us pay. I don't know if you'd call this divine providence, miraculous nature. I don't know exactly what category that would fall into. But at any rate, Jesus finds the sum that will pay the tax for both of these men. All right, there's what happens in Matthew 17. We've given a few notes about why this matters. But what's really happening? What have the disciples experienced? What have they learned? And can we have their experience and try to learn what they learned as well, simply by viewing things through their eyes? Let me give 3 simple admonitions as we close this morning. It is imperative as we read this account that we understand the first need, the most pressing and immediate need, which is to hear him, to hear Jesus Christ. I'm sure that the main takeaway from the Mount of Transfiguration was plain for Peter and James and John. Maybe I'm surmising too much, I don't know. But if I had that same experience, what might have impressed me more than anything else that happened there was hearing the voice come out of the cloud in verse 5. What your eyes see, you can kind of explain some way, and there's just a quality to seeing something that we're used to. We're used to believing what our eyes see and somehow computing that in our heads and making sense of it. But seeing this great cloud of God's glory and hearing what must have been an astounding voice come forth from it, and not only a voice, but a voice that gives such pointed, directed statement, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." To me, that's the part of this that leaves the impression. It was that sound that had driven them face first to the ground in fear. Just as Moses had foretold, so it was happening. Here's the great prophet of promise that the whole nation should listen to. That's what he says in Deuteronomy 18 in verse 15. There will be a prophet from among you like me, and when he shows, listen to him. Pay attention. So now Peter, James, and John are being told, yes, do it. Hear him. The verb tense that Matthew uses to reflect God's words indicates an ongoing event. We might translate it just as well, I think, by saying, keep on listening to him. Don't just hear him right now. This next statement that he's about to make, keep hearing him. This seems especially needed based on what Jesus was saying throughout this period of time and what the disciples, Peter in particular, rejected. Over and over, Jesus is telling them of his death. You will find repeated, increasingly plain, increasingly pointed, increasingly dire predictions of his death. And again, they don't like to hear it. Every time Jesus brings it up, you get the disciples getting uncomfortable and starting to say, here we go again with this. Lord, quit talking that way. They're sorrowful. They ask questions that show they don't understand. They don't want it to happen. They don't want to dwell upon it. They hate the very idea of what he's talking about. Peter's rebuke that he would offer to Jesus in chapter 16 that immediately precedes this great revelation, I take to be a sign that he wasn't doing yet what all disciples have to do when their master speaks, to hear him. It does not matter if we like it. It doesn't matter if we think at the moment that it is the best. It is our duty to keep on listening to him over and above anything else that may have our ear at the time. That's what Peter is being told, and the other disciples too. You might think you have this figured out, and that you're going to tell Jesus what he should and shouldn't be doing, and what should and shouldn't happen with the Messiah. But cut all of that out and listen to him. He's going to tell you what will be. He's going to tell you what must happen. He is going to tell you what God will do and what that will mean for the entirety of the human race. Listen to that. Can we see the need for us just as clearly? That we hear him, that we are attentive to his voice. But of course, we see the need as well, not just to hear and to perceive what's being said, but to believe what Jesus has said. Here were men, as you moved into verse 14, you find the remaining disciples at the foot of the mountain. You have men who had been given authority in specific areas, one of them being to cast out demons. And yet they're flailing around uselessly before a seemingly unsolvable problem. Michael Green, writing about this, says, were they powerless? It was attributable to lack of faith. So often when knowledge about God grows, actual dependence on God shrinks. And we might see this in churches. The more settled and established a church becomes, the more it needs to learn afresh that it can achieve precisely nothing without sincere dependence on the Lord. This seems to be the problem the disciples are facing here. Unbelief characterized the world at large at the time, but we hate to see it in the disciples. How tragic when God's people begin to take on the attributes of the world around us, the perverse world around us, chiefly in not believing God for what he has said. So what was their unbelief? That's what Jesus rebukes and chastises them for in verse 20. Why could we not cast it out? He says, because of your unbelief. What does that even mean? They believed in God. These weren't atheists. They believed that Jesus was the Christ. They had all just said so right to his face 6 days before. They believed that it was possible to do what they were trying to do. They had, as we've mentioned a couple of times, actually done this before. When he had sent them out with power, they came back saying, that was incredible. We were casting out demons. We were healing people. This was really extraordinary. They had done this before. So what is it that they didn't believe? I would submit that this seems to be unbelief or lack of faith through the means of actually misplacing their faith or their confidence. It looks like the disciples have failed to completely recognize the source of their power. And maybe that's betrayed a little bit in their question. Why could we not cast it out? If it required prayer, which is an appeal to God, if it required fasting, which is an appeal to God so full that other things are forsaken, why had that thought not occurred to them? Isn't that a strange thing that Jesus says? You couldn't do it because of unbelief in verse 20, and then in verse 21, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. What were you guys doing if you couldn't do this and you weren't praying to God for some help in the matter? You're just really out there trying to do it all by yourself? Try to, concentrate really hard and will yourself to have miraculous power that you know doesn't originate in you? That's what their unbelief was. They believed in God. They believed in Christ. They believed in the power that he had given them. But apparently somewhere along the way, they had lost sight of, in fact, where that power truly came from. Howard Hendricks tells of a short couplet that was written in the front of his Bible as a young man that helped him often through the years. When I try, I fail. When I trust, he succeeds. And that seems a pretty simple, maybe useful maxim for us to live by. When I try, I fail. When I trust, he succeeds. We see Paul maybe learning a similar lesson through his threefold appeal to God to remove the thorn in the flesh, and the Lord's answer comes back, my strength is made perfect in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you. It will not be your power, it will be mine. Who will banish the demons? Who will heal? Who will save? Not me, not us. We must be fully convinced that God alone can, and that God alone will. If that is our attitude, one of complete reliance upon the sufficiency of God, then nothing will be impossible for us. Not moving mountains. We don't know what the channel will be through which God can work, but it is a trust that he can and will work. If we're unwilling to ask God for the impossible, then perhaps we too have been shaped by the perversity of our generation. Chumley writes that. Have we been? Have we been corroded by the doubt that we see so much around us? Or do we too believe him? We believe the impossible. We believe the incredible things that he has said, that he has promised, that he has done. Finally, this passage aches for us to understand the need to follow him. Jesus predicted his death the first time, and in chapter 16, when it was first offered, invited his disciples to take up their crosses and to follow him. The second time he predicts his death. The invitation to follow him is gentler, I suppose. No imagery of a death march with a cross on their backs. It's more subtle. He demonstrates however, with his submission to the temple tax, exactly who he is and what he is about. His chief identity is as the Son of God, and his chief concern is to obey in all things the will of the Father, even to the point of death on the cross. But even with that great cosmically significant date looming over his head, he will continue to consider others. For their sake, he says. I'm often amazed at simple little phrases like that Jesus sprinkles in his conversation when you consider who he actually is and some of the things that he is talking about. Right after that discussion in verses 22 and 23, can you imagine? I'm going to go die. I'm going to go be tortured to death. I'm going to be betrayed by one of my best friends in this life. And men are going to hate me and ridicule me and spit upon me and do all manner of things vile and wicked and malicious and scorn God in the process. I'm going to have all of these things happen to me. And then in the next breath, you find yourself saying, to make sure that we don't offend someone else, here's what we're going to do, Peter. If I know I'm about to be murdered, I don't care if somebody gets offended that I don't pay my tax, quite honestly. That's something for him to worry about. I got bigger things going on in my life. But this is not ever the disposition of the Savior. He always considers the other. He always considers the one who might be offended. He always considers the one who might be scandalized and might be made to stumble. And he always removes that block before they trip on it. Jesus cares for us. He always has. He always will. If it means paying a tax he has no obligation to pay so that others won't stumble, he'll do it. And who will humbly obey along with him? It's fitting in this passage that Jesus closes at the end of verse 17 by saying, give it to them for me and for you. You're doing this with me, Peter. We're in the same boat. We pay together. Peter and any other disciple who would walk with him walks with him. They follow. Here is a Savior